Welcome! In this series of videos, we will look at software add-ons for the PowerBasic Windows compiler. Today we will look again at using the MyLittleGrid custom grid and SQL tools with SQL Server to speed up your application development. This was our application at the end of the last video. We have a PowerBasic Windows application displaying a dialog on screen containing a grid. This is the MyLittleGrid add-on for PowerBasic. This grid we're using to display the names of the employees of a company. It's currently displaying in the grid 2000 records. One thing that MyLittleGrid will do for you without you having to write a single line of code is the ability to split a grid. This particular grid is showing a number of columns within the grid, and all columns are visible. If we added 5 or 6 more columns to this grid, then some of the grid columns would not be visible unless you use the horizontal scroll bar at the bottom of the grid. However, one of the features of MyLittleGrid is the widget at the bottom right hand corner of the grid. If you move the mouse over this widget, you'll see the icon changes, and if you hold down the left mouse button, you can move this widget to the left, which will allow you to split the grid. Therefore, all columns to the left of this split will remain stationary, and you can then scroll quite happily to the right. This way, the columns that designate who the person is are visible at all times, and the rest of the columns can be scrolled. To put this back to normal, you merely have to move the mouse over the widget and move it back to the right again. There is also the same widget for moving up and down and splitting the grid from top to bottom. These are very easy to use, and users will find them very useful, and it saves you writing any code at all. So today we're going to add a few more features to our application. The first thing I want to add is a toolbar at the top of the dialog. This toolbar will be used to contain buttons to allow you to add new users to our database, to save any changes you've made within the grid, and also to give you the option of clicking on a help button and also getting reports. So how can we easily add that to our application with the minimal amount of code? Well, we're going to add a library which we created in a previous video called PB Toolbar. And that's our library added. As well as adding the library, we need to define a constant that's going to be used to identify the main toolbar. And having set that up, we need to go into our dialog definition and put some more code in. So if we go to where we show the dialog, and after the PB Forms End dialog, we're going to paste in a line of text to add a toolbar to our dialog, using the Control Add Toolbar command. Then all we need to do to put the icons on our toolbar is to call a function within our toolbar library. So the create toolbar function merely takes 2 parameters, the dialog handle and the constant that defines the main toolbar. So having put these very few lines of code into our application, if we try running that now, we'll see our application runs quite happily, and we now have a toolbar at the top of the screen. So this can be very quickly used to show our users what the toolbar will look like. You can of course add more icons and more buttons to the toolbar as need demands. So having now added the toolbar, we're now going to look at the grid and shift our focus there. Users will at one point want to actually make amendments to data within the grid. For example, changing the department a particular member of staff is actually in. And they will need an easy and quite intuitive way of actually doing that. Now we already have a list of all the departments that exist in our Departments tab. This was obtained by running a stored procedure on the database to give us a distinct list of all departments. So we need a nice easy way of allowing the user to change a department to any other department. We can do this without changing our application at all. If we exit this and go back to our configuration utility, we'll see in here this is where we defined the columns that appear in the grid. And one of the columns is indeed the department. Now that column is currently locked so the user can make no changes. So if we untick that so that it can be updated. We're going to click the column drop-down tick box, which means the cell will change from a text box to a text box with a drop-down. And then further over, there is a column drop-down store procedures field. Now we're going to paste into this field the command which we're going to use to extract the distinct list of departments. If we have a look at our code, in the events handler, where the initialized dialog is, we have our two store procedures, one that populates the user list grid and one which populates the department list. So if we copy that line of code straight into this field. And as you can see from this grid, we're using the functionality we're going to be using later on our own grid within our application. We have changed the value of these fields within the grid, and they have been highlighted in a nice bright green colour, which means they're changing the grid but they're not yet saved to the database. So we click on the Save button to save them into the database, and the green colour disappears. So if we just run the application again now without changing the code at all, we'll see that the grid comes up quite happily, but when you click on one of the cells containing a department, you now get a little drill down button, which if you click on that, it gives you the drop down. So it means we can quite easily change the value of the department for any user by clicking on a different department. Now we haven't put the code in yet to highlight the fact that this field has actually changed. We'll be doing that in the next video. So one other thing we can do within the code which makes it very easy for a user to actually do things is a right click on a field. We have already set up, when we defined our grid, the content of this pop-up window to contain three strings: copy cell, sort and revoke change. Copy cell we intend to use to allow the application to copy the value within the currently selected cell. So let's have a look to see how we can actually do that. If we have a look at the event handler of the dialog, inside here is where all the code will actually sit that is triggered when some event happens on the object on screen. Now so far we haven't put any event handling in whatsoever for my little grid, and that's what we're going to do right now. So in order to make this as easy as possible, we're going to add a new library. I've created a macro library with a mere 2 functions in it to allow us to actually add things quite easily for my little grid. Let's have a look at that library. This library only has 2 functions within it. One for the grid events header and one for the grid events body. The macros have a very powerful way of actually designating code that can be parachuted into your application prior to compilation. So with a simple addition of one line of code, all this additional code can be slotted right into your application. So if we have a look at the event handler of our dialog, so by simply placing this single line of code at the top of our callback function, then all these definitions of local variables are going to appear in our code when we compile it. This saves a great deal of typing. So now that that's in place, we need to put in the actual event handler itself. Now I'm going to put the event handler in here, and this is going to be a WM notify event. This is used where objects on the screen are going to send notifications back to our callback function to say that something has occurred within that particular object. And immediately after this, we're going to put in the second macro, and this second macro will put this piece of text in place, which is the beginning of a select block. Now we need to tell the application which object we're actually wanting to pick up these notifications from. Now, as we have one grid on the screen, we'll be using the handle for that grid in order to determine what happens within that grid. If you had 2 grids, you would need 2 case statements. So what we're going to do is we're going to use an additional select statement to pick up the actual event on the grid itself. And this is the event we're interested in. This is the right click menu. This will pick up when the user has right clicked on the grid. There are 3 items of information on this right click we're interested in. There's the menu item picked, which is going to be item 1, item 2 or item 3. There's going to be the column we're currently on and the row we are currently on. So the first thing is to copy something to the clipboard. So that was the first item on the grid. So we use another select case one on this to pick up the item, and for case 1 we're copying to the clipboard. So we have a variable called strText, which is going to be used to contain the text within the cell that we're actually picking up, and we're going to use a function within the MyLittleGrid library called mlgget. This takes 3 parameters: the grid handle, the row number and the column number, which we got coming up here. This function will pull out the text within that cell and will pass it to strText. We can then use our standard clipboard reset function to clear any information out of the clipboard, and we can then set the text on the clipboard to be whatever was in strText. We can then close off our select commands, and we can try running our code. So if we right click on any field and click copy cell, this should have copied the information within that cell to the clipboard. So if we launch Notepad, right click, paste, and there's the data. So we can successfully copy from any cell in the grid to the clipboard. This gives users a very easy way of getting information out of the grid. We will in a later video show you how you can copy the entire grid to the clipboard and allow the user to paste this into any other application that supports pasting, for example Excel. So having handled the first element on the pop-up of copying the cell, we now want to use the sort command. This should allow us to sort data within the grid on any column. So let's go back to the code and we'll put that in. So now we're on case 2, which is the second item picked. This is where we want to sort the column. We're going to use the send message command to send back to the grid a command to tell it to sort the array that sits behind the grid. We have 2 options in this. We can sort it in ascending order or descending order, and we need to tell it which column we're sorting on. Now this is an alphanumeric sort, not a numeric one, so it will sort all the text alphanumerically, even if it's a number column. And having done the sort on the array behind the grid, we then have to use a grid refresh command to tell the grid to redisplay the array on the grid on the screen. So if we try running that now, we can click on any cell which highlights our column, right click and then sort. So we've effectively very quickly sorted the entire grid by the department. We can sort them by surname by selecting that one, or city. As I said, since it's an alphanumeric sort, if we sort it on a numeric column, it will be sorted in an alphanumeric manner. However, this does give you a very quick way of actually grouping information on the screen that the user can quite intuitively use, and it can be done without re-querying the database. So today we have added to our application a toolbar to illustrate to the user how they can add items and save changes. We have allowed the user to be able to copy any individual cell in the grid to the clipboard. We've allowed the user to be able to sort the entire grid by any individual column. And we've also allowed the user to be able to actually amend the data within the grid for the department using a drop-down. What we'll cover in our next video is highlighting the changes the user has made to the grid on the screen, and then allow them to save those changes back to the database. But that's it for today. Thank you for watching.